There are moments in history when the world holds its breath, when the machinery of diplomacy stalls and the machinery of war starts turning. February 28th, 2026 was one of those moments. In the pre-dawn hours, American and Israeli warplanes pierced Iranian airspace in a coordinated assault that shook the foundations of the Middle East. What followed was not a skirmish. It was not a calculated warning shot. It was a war, and understanding how it began requires going back much further than that single night. The roots of this confrontation stretch back to December 2024, when the United Nations nuclear watchdog, the IAEA, reported Iran enriching uranium to levels approaching weapons grade. It also documented an unprecedented stockpile of highly enriched uranium, material that, by the agency's own assessment, had no credible civilian purpose, and gave Iran the capacity to produce enough fissile material for multiple nuclear bombs on short notice. This was not a theoretical threat buried in diplomatic cables. It was a countdown clock, and governments across the world were watching it tick. When Donald Trump returned to the White House in January 2025, he immediately reinstated his maximum pressure campaign against Tehran, a strategy designed to economically asphyxiate Iran into a new nuclear agreement, prevent its development of weapons, and counter its regional influence. He declared he would not tolerate an Iranian nuclear weapons capability and did not rule out military action if diplomacy failed. His administration made the position explicit. All options were on the table. But Trump also knew that pressure without a diplomatic off-ramp creates its own dangers. In March 2025, he took an unusual step. He wrote directly to Iran's supreme leader Ali Khamenei, proposing new nuclear negotiations. The letter carried both an olive branch and a threat. Accept this proposal or face serious military consequences. Iran was already fractured from within. Beginning in late December 2025, massive nationwide anti-government protests erupted across the country, originally driven by a catastrophic economic crisis, the collapse of the rial, skyrocketing prices, and years of suffocating sanctions. But the protests evolved rapidly into something far more dangerous for the regime: explicit calls for the overthrow of the Islamic Republic itself. By some estimates, 5 million Iranians took to the streets, the largest protest movement since the 1979 revolution that had created the Islamic Republic in the first place. The government's response was savage. Iranian security forces killed thousands of protesters in the crackdown, with the deadliest incidents occurring between January 8th and 10th, 2026. Human rights organizations documented death tolls ranging from thousands to tens of thousands. A regime that had survived 46 years of external pressure was now hemorrhaging from the inside. Trump responded on January 2nd, posting on Truth Social that if Iran violently killed peaceful protesters, the United States would come to their rescue, declaring his forces were locked and loaded and ready to go. Iranian officials fired back immediately. Senior advisor Ali Larijani warned Trump that intervention would mean chaos in the entire region and the destruction of U.S. interests, and cautioned that American soldiers in the region should be mindful of what their own president had started. This was no longer the language of negotiation. This was the language of men standing at the edge of a cliff, testing the other's nerve. Through February, Trump escalated his public posture dramatically. On February 13th, he declared that regime change in Iran would be the best thing that could happen. A day later, U.S. officials confirmed the military was preparing for weeks-long sustained operations against Iran. Then, on February 24th, in his State of the Union address to the nation, Trump accused Iran of reviving its nuclear weapons program and developing advanced ballistic missiles capable of threatening Europe and American bases across the region. He warned they were working toward missiles that would one day reach the United States itself. The chamber fell quiet. The world was watching. Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, responded the very next day by insisting a historic opportunity for agreement was still within reach. A third round of indirect talks was scheduled in Geneva for February 26th, but on February 20th, Trump had already issued a 10-day deadline: negotiate seriously or face the consequences. The Geneva talks produced no breakthrough. The gap was too wide, the clock too short. On February 28th, 2026, the United States and Israel launched a large-scale attack on Iran. Among those killed was Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei himself, the man who had led the Islamic Republic for 34 years, who had outlasted 8 American presidents, who had guided Iran through sanctions, assassinations, and proxy wars across 4 countries, was dead. The strikes did not stop there. Subsequent attacks damaged military bases, government facilities, schools, hospitals, and cultural heritage sites. Iran's elaborate air defense network, built over decades with Russian and Chinese assistance, was overwhelmed. The Islamic Republic had been struck at its very center of gravity. Iran's retaliation was immediate and broad. Hundreds of drones and ballistic missiles were launched at targets inside Israel and at U.S. military bases in Bahrain, Jordan, and Kuwait. The Persian Gulf, one of the most strategically critical waterways on Earth, became a war zone overnight. Iran moved to shut down the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow passage through which roughly 20% of the world's oil supply flows. Iranian forces began striking ships and tankers attempting to transit the strait, and the price of oil surged dramatically. Economies from Tokyo to London began recalculating the cost of what had just been set in motion. The world had not seen anything like this since the Gulf War of 1991, and even that had been a more contained affair. On the diplomatic front, every major European nation voiced alarm. While some offered to help keep the Strait of Hormuz open to international shipping once hostilities ceased, none sent military forces to join the U.S.-Israeli offensive. Spain went furthest, refusing the use of its bases and barring American warplanes from transiting its airspace for operations connected to the war. The Atlantic Alliance was showing fractures. Iran's foreign ministry was blunt in its messaging to the world. Everyone must recognize that Iran did not start this war. Iran was attacked while in the middle of a diplomatic process, for the second time within 9 months. By March 22nd, Iran struck back at Israel's nuclear infrastructure. Missiles hit the southern Israeli cities of Dimona and Arad, targeting the area around Israel's main nuclear research center. Around 116 people were injured in Arad and 64 in Dimona. Iranian media confirmed the strikes were retaliation for an Israeli attack on Iran's Natanz nuclear facility the previous week. The war had now crossed a threshold that analysts had long warned about. Both sides targeting each other's nuclear infrastructure, with the IAEA's Director General calling for maximum military restraint near nuclear facilities, his words carrying all the weight and none of the power of a man watching a fire and asking people not to throw gasoline. By late March 2026, Trump threatened to blow up and completely obliterate Iran's electric plants and oil wells if a deal to end the war was not reached. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt confirmed that U.S. troops were being sent to the Middle East to give the president what she called maximum optionality, while officials insisted they were still pursuing a diplomatic solution. It was a phrase that captured the contradictory logic of the entire enterprise. Troops surging forward while diplomats reached for phones. Leavitt declined to promise Trump would seek congressional authorization before deploying troops inside Iran, saying at that moment it was unnecessary and that Trump likes to maintain options at his disposal. Congress, meanwhile, was demanding answers that the administration was not providing. Representative Jason Crow, a Democrat and combat veteran, said the war was entering its 4th week with more questions than answers, and that Congress still was not getting clear explanations of the strategy or endgame. Trump himself, in an interview with the Financial Times, stated he wanted to take the oil in Iran and could seize Karg Island, the offshore terminal through which nearly 90% of Iran's oil exports flow. Iran's parliament speaker responded with a direct warning. Our men are waiting for the arrival of American soldiers on the ground to set them on fire. Analysts debating the prospect of a ground invasion were cautious. Military experts told Al Jazeera that U.S. deployments pointed to limited, high-intensity operations, seizing strategic islands in the Strait of Hormuz, carrier-based strikes on Iranian air defenses, helicopter and marine assaults to neutralize threats and secure key terrain, rather than the kind of full-scale ground invasion that defined Iraq in 2003. But wars rarely follow the blueprints of those who start them. Iran formally rejected Trump's ceasefire proposal and laid out 5 conditions of its own, including war reparations and Iranian sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz. Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Bahrain, found themselves in the crossfire of a war they had not chosen. The UAE announced it was intercepting drones and missiles from Iran. Kuwait issued warnings about missile and drone threats. Bahrain sounded sirens and instructed residents to take shelter. The ripples of a war between superpowers and a regional power were washing across every nation in the Persian Gulf basin, none of them powerful enough to stop it, all of them exposed to its consequences. As of late March 2026, approximately 300 Russian specialists remained at Iran's Bushehr nuclear power plant, down from a higher number after Rosatom began evacuations. Projectiles had struck the area around the plant multiple times, and while Iranian authorities insisted all safety systems remained stable, the specter of a nuclear accident, not from a weapon, but from the chaos of war, hung over the region like a shadow no diplomat could dispel. The Trump administration's stated justifications for the war shifted repeatedly, from preempting Iranian retaliation against U.S. assets, to preventing Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon, to destroying Iran's missile capabilities, to securing Iran's oil resources, to achieving regime change. Iranian officials, and some within the United States, rejected the most urgent of these claims. The IAEA, the world's foremost nuclear authority, had stated plainly that while Iran had an ambitious nuclear program, there was no evidence of a structured nuclear weapons program when the 2026 war began. It was a detail buried beneath the noise of missile alerts and oil markets. But it was a detail that history would not forget. What is unfolding in the Persian Gulf is not simply a military campaign. It is the convergence of decades of unresolved tensions, nuclear anxieties, economic warfare, and the particular combustibility of a second Trump term meeting a weakened but defiant Iran. Whether it ends in a negotiated settlement, regime change, or something far darker remains, as of today, unknown. What is known is this. The Middle East has entered a chapter with no clear last page, and the world, watching from a distance that feels increasingly insufficient, is left to wonder where the next line will be drawn and who will cross it.